Hello again. Welcome to the third and final part of this series on the history of early game sound. Today we're going to talk about ways that sound was generated in early games. We're going to talk about the simplest buzzers, which you've already heard in action. We're going to talk about the advent of programmable sound generators. And finally, the use of optical media, the use of essentially music playing technologies to add sound to arcade games that otherwise operated with PSGs or programmable sound generators. The simplest games, such as Pong, you heard, operated with essentially just a buzzer. This was just passing some current through a little oscillator and creating a sound. So one of the very simple ways that this was done, and one of the ways that we'll recreate later in this class, is through what's called a piezo element or a piezo buzzer. And essentially the principle here, you can see this diagrammed and you can see a photo of an actual piezo buzzer. And essentially current is being passed through the red wire, the hot wire, and that causes this little ceramic element to expand and contract ever so slightly along with the current. It correlates with the current. So if you can control the amount of current that you're passing towards it, you can control the pitch essentially, and not only create a little buzzer sound, but you can actually change the pitch at which it vibrates, and you can play simple tunes or you can create simple sound effects. So this is the kind of technology that was heard in some of those very early games. It acts as a buzzer, or maybe it can play a short little tune at the beginning or end of something. This, I suspect, is what you're hearing when you look at Circus, this Atari cabinet that comes up elsewhere in this unit, that sort of plays little fanfares just when you win or when you lose. That's most likely handled by a piezo buzzer. Next, we have programmable sound generators. This is the next level of sophistication above a single buzzer. PSGs will differ in at least two ways. Number one, they're going to generate different kinds of waveforms. Some of them are very simple, they're very limited in their waveforms. As you get slightly more sophisticated, such as the Nintendo Entertainment System in the mid-1980s, you can actually choose between a couple of different kinds of waveforms. If you remember back to our sound unit, the sound or the tone quality, the timbre of something is determined by the kind of waveform that you're creating. If it's a simple one like a sine wave, a slightly quirkier one like a triangle wave or a sawtooth wave, those have certain sonic patterns to them. And then a lot of the actual musical sounds or sounds we hear in the world are composite waveforms, multiple different waveforms sort of coming together to form a unique contour that lets us hear, a violin or an organ or a trumpet or whatever. So programmable sound generators begin to be able to manipulate the tone quality a little bit. And the second way they differ from the simplest buzzers is that programmable sound generators will offer you multiple channels. So the Atari 2600 had two channels so that you could play melody and harmony, or melody and bass, or maybe melody and some sound effects. And then the Nintendo Entertainment System, very famously has four different synthesis channels. Two wave channels that are exactly alike, and they're usually used for melody and sound effects. Triangle wave channel is usually used for bass, and then it was also able to create white noise of various frequencies and various timbres. So four synthesis channels. This would also carry through to the Game Boy, and we'll hear more about those in the unit on the Nintendo Entertainment System. So programmable sound generators, or even the simpler setups, came along at a time in the early 1980s when video game development teams were still very small. If you think about contemporary franchises, a Bethesda game, a Grand Theft Auto, a Rockstar game, is built by hundreds of people. The Zelda games are built by teams of hundreds of people, and you have dozens of artists and dozens of programmers and dozens of 3D modelers and, a composer and a whole sound team, tons and tons of people. game design teams in the late 70s into the 1980s were very, very small. Count them on one hand probably. A couple of developers, maybe somebody is doing the sound, maybe somebody is doing the graphics, while a few other people are doing the code. So just 4 or 5 engineers and a product manager are doing all the development, or even smaller. Some of these games are actually almost solo efforts, or the efforts of a duo, a pair of developers. So in those days, it often fell to one programmer to create the sound, and maybe if you were lucky, they were a trained musician, and if you weren't, they sort of had to go with it, and they had to work with what they could. And these early systems, even though something like the Atari 2600 started to be more sophisticated, it still had severe limitations. So Ron Hubbard, a game developer and programmer, sound programmer, talks about the early days here when things were still a little bit rough around the edges. He writes, "The games that were around in like 1982, 1983, most of the music was done by the programmer. The programmer did everything in those days, and some of the music was just absolutely diabolical. I mean, it was embarrassing. It was like a drunken monkey on the piano trying to play the Blue Danube Waltz or something. And I thought there has to be an opening for somebody who can at least get the notes right or in the correct order, for God's sake." So in the early 1980s, there are a couple of games that sort of have the evidence of having a dedicated sound programmer, a dedicated composer, and eventually at Atari, for instance, with a company that I've studied in some detail, eventually this led to the creation of a sound department in 1984 or so, who would work on multiple games and provide their sound and music expertise to all the different development teams working at once. And we'll go ahead and hear one example of this. One of the more interesting little side chapters in the history of game music is actually a tie-in game with the band Journey, who I'm sure you've heard of, with one of their albums. This was a game on the 2600 where I believe the premise is that you're a Journey roadie and all their equipment has been stolen from some kind of intergalactic concert, and it's your job to get it back, and you have to fight all of these sort of surreal images from the album art. You can sort of see this directly back to back. On the left there is the album cover for Escape, and on the right hand side here is the Atari 2600 cabinet with that album art right there. And so this is a strange little tie-in. There's actually an arcade tie-in as well that actually uses digitized versions of the band's faces on sort of digital bodies going around and having an adventure. This one's a little bit more abstract. The Atari was a lot less capable, but you'll hear the music and you'll get a sense for what, just how rough some of this music could be. You'll hear, if you listen closely, I'm sure you'll recognize Don't Stop Believin', but you'll hear that the rhythm is a little bit off. Everything's very square. It's not actually as funky and flowing as the real song is, and a lot of things are a little bit out of tune because of the physical limitations of the Atari. Finally, our third category here is optical media. And essentially, by optical media, I mean existing musical formats such as tape, in this case 8-track tapes, and laser discs. So when we say optical media, essentially we mean a physical medium that is being read, is having musical information sort of decoded right off of it. Tapes will use a sort of magnetic head to read the magnetic encoding on the physical tape, and then laser discs, obviously the name, it's right there in the name, use lasers to decode them. This was a sort of a precursor technology to DVDs and developing around the same time as CDs. So laser read optical discs. These were first available in the 1980s. So 8-track tapes didn't really survive, and to my knowledge haven't really had a revival, but these were popular in the 1970s. You had them in car stereos, you had them in home stereos, and in this case you actually sometimes saw them in video games. So they had this thick tape, and you could put 8 individual tracks of music, and sort of you would use these in stereo, and you could essentially have 4 tracks here. So it was a way to divide albums into a couple of different chunks. You can sort of see here how the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album is divided up into what they call 4 different programs here. So you can sort of switch between them. You can listen to the first one, or you can skip right ahead to the second one if you want to hear Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, whatever. So some kind of control, but not as fine-grained as you got on CDs or obviously digital audio players. And one of the interesting examples here is this game called Triple Hunt by Atari. As the name suggests, you have 3 different sort of hunting games. One of them is actually a haunted house with ghosts and witches on brooms. The other ones are trying to shoot a bear and trying to shoot a raccoon. So you'll see in the picture here, there's actually a little plastic background around there, a frame where the arcade operator could set the game to be, say in this case, the bear hunting game. So they have the forest, and along with that little plastic frame came an 8-track tape that would play appropriate sounds for these games. So you had sort of spooky wind blowing for the haunted house, or as you're about to hear, you have forest noises for the hunting games. So you're going to hear digital buzzing, which represents the player's shots, but then also you're going to hear an actual tape recording of wildlife, ambiance in the forest. The other format that I mentioned is Laserdisc. As you can see here with the person's hand for scale, this is like the size of a record. And this was another technology, came out in the late 1970s, was still around into the 80s, but it sort of lost out to VHS for being much more convenient and accessible, and then eventually DVDs. Laserdiscs were very expensive. They were $40 or $50 to buy one movie. So they ended up being kind of an impractical technology for home video, and they lost out to the much cheaper video cassettes, which were lower quality, but cheaper, more convenient, more accessible. So as I said, you could buy movies on these, and there were also experiments using Laserdiscs to create video games. So the most famous of these games is called Dragon's Lair. As you can see here, Dragon's Lair has sort of a Saturday morning cartoon aesthetic, sort of this 70s, 80s cartoon look to it. And you'll see that the way the game works is it's essentially a reaction time based game. Each time the game gives you a little prompt, you'll hear this little sort of beep, and you'll usually see one side of the screen flashing. You had to move a joystick really fast to that side. So the left flashes, you move to the left. The right flashes, you move to the right. And doing this successfully triggers the next sequence. And this game is put together out of a ton, dozens and dozens of very short sequences. Some of them only 1 or 2 seconds long. Some of them are a little bit longer. If you moved successfully, you go on, which is what you're going to see since this is a full playthrough video. But if you failed, if you went the wrong way, or if you didn't do it in time, your character would die a gruesome death. And there are dozens of different ways to die just constantly in Dragons.
Okay.
So as I said, this was one of the most famous Laserdisc games. It's actually featured in one of the seasons of Stranger Things. I think it's the second season when they're in the arcade when they first meet Max. It opens with Dustin playing Dragon's Lair. And you actually see in that sequence that these cabinets often had a top TV screen as well, so that your friends could see, people could stand around and watch the TV almost as if it's a cartoon. And meanwhile, you have your own screen sort of in the traditional setup that you're focused on and reacting to. So what you can see from this is that the technologies that were available really varied a lot. You had very simple solutions. You had slightly more sophisticated multi-track synthesis solutions. I talked a little bit about the development of arcade games, and one of the ways in which arcade games diverged from home console games is that, like I said, arcade games had to be built from scratch. This was often a painstaking design process, but it also meant that arcade games of the 1980s could be more sophisticated than what you could have at home. If you had a new development, or if you had the extra budget or the extra hardware space, you could put more sophisticated sound and more sophisticated graphics in arcade games in the 1980s than you could have at home. And this is sort of perfectly exemplified by Laserdisc. There was never, to my knowledge, a Laserdisc-based home video game system. There may have been some unsuccessful experiments with it, but this was something that you could do in an arcade where you could afford to put a Laserdisc player and a TV screen in there and a second TV screen. And as you saw, the graphics obviously have the cartoon aesthetic, but they're so much more detailed and so much more vibrant and colorful than any other arcade game of the time, any other examples that we've seen in this units. But the trade-off is that if you're using media like a Laserdisc, the game's not actually that interactive. You know, you're never really directly controlling the knight in Dragon's Lair. It's this trade-off where you can have this reaction time game, you can queue up the next animation clip, but you're never actually in control. And we'll see in week 3 when we talk about modern technologies of sound and music in games that this is a trade-off that you still struggle with. You can have high fidelity, but that means that you're less flexible in what you can do. If you sort of remove music from that very close relationship to code, maybe it sounds more realistic, maybe the animation looks better or more exciting, or you can use full motion video, but you can no longer interact with it. It's this way in which video games as a medium kind of butt up against non-interactive media like films and television. So that gives you your quick introduction to the history of game sound. I'll post in the description, and there's obviously lots more in the class, for further reading some of the sources for this video and some of the places that you can go if you want to see and hear and read more about early video game sound and music.